The first time Julian saw Theo, it was like watching a storm roll in, beautiful, unpredictable, and dangerous enough to make his heart stutter. They were in a crowded Brooklyn cafe, the kind where artists and dreamers spilled their souls into overpriced lattes. And Theo was sketching furiously in a worn notebook, his dark curls falling over his eyes. Julian, nursing a black coffee and a bruised ego from another failed audition, couldn't look away. It wasn't just Theo's looks, though. Those sharp cheekbones and hazel eyes could stop traffic. It was the way he moved, like he carried a secret that could burn the world down. Julian, at 25, was no stranger to secrets. Growing up gay in a small Ohio town had taught him to hide parts of himself, to smile through the slurs and keep his head down. New York was supposed to be his escape, his rebirth into a life where he could love freely. But freedom, he was learning, came with its own kind of chains. Theo glanced up, catching Julian staring. A slow, knowing smile spread across his face, and Julian felt his stomach flip. "You gonna keep gawking? Or you gonna say something?" Theo's voice was low, teasing, with a southern lilt that didn't quite match the city's pulse. Julian flushed, fumbling for words, but Theo was already sliding into the seat across from him, notebook abandoned. "I'm Theo. And you look like you're running from something." That was the hook. Theo saw through him in seconds. Julian, who'd spent years building walls, felt them crack under that gaze. They talked for hours, about everything and nothing: Julian's dreams of Broadway, Theo's sketches that captured strangers' souls, the way the city felt like a lover who never quite loved you back. By the time they parted, Julian had Theo's number scrawled on a napkin and a feeling he couldn't shake that this was the start of something that would either save him or destroy him. The next few weeks were a blur of late-night texts and stolen moments. Theo was a whirlwind, dragging Julian to underground art shows, speakeasies tucked behind bodegas, places that felt like they belonged to another world. He was fearless in a way Julian envied, kissing him in the middle of a crowded subway platform, laughing when passers-by stared. But there was an edge to Theo, a darkness that surfaced in quiet moments. He'd go silent mid-sentence, eyes distant, or snap at a harmless question about his past. Julian chalked it up to the artist's temperament, but something deeper gnawed at him. One night, under the flickering lights of a Williamsburg dive bar, Theo leaned in close, his breath warm against Julian's ear. "You ever feel like you're waiting for the other shoe to drop?" he whispered. Julian nodded, his heart racing, not from the question, but from the way Theo's fingers brushed his wrist. "Yeah," Theo said, pulling back with a smirk. "That's how I feel with you. Like you're too good, and I'm gonna ruin it." Julian laughed it off, but the word stuck. They were falling hard, fast, in that reckless way that only happens when you're young and desperate to feel alive. Theo's apartment became their sanctuary, a tiny studio cluttered with canvases and half-finished sculptures. They'd lie on the floor, sharing cheap wine and stories, Theo's head on Julian's chest as they dreamed of a future where they could just be. But love, Julian was starting to realize, wasn't the clean rebirth he'd hoped for. It was messy, jagged, full of sharp edges that cut when you least expected. Then came the first crack. It was a Saturday, and Julian had shown up at Theo's unannounced, a rare day off from waiting tables. The door was ajar, and inside, Theo was arguing with some Ania man's voice, sharp and venomous. Julian froze, catching fragments. "You think you can just walk away, Theo? After everything?" Theo's voice was raw, pleading, not the confident artist Julian knew. When the stranger stormed out, a tall, wiry guy with a cruel twist to his mouth, Theo looked like he'd been gutted. "Who was that?" Julian asked, stepping inside. Theo's face shuddered, his warmth replaced by something cold. Nobody, he said, too quickly. Just an old friend. But the lie hung heavy between them, and Julian felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. Theo wouldn't meet his eyes, and for the first time, Julian wondered if the storm he'd fallen for was more dangerous than he'd thought. That night, Theo kissed him harder than usual, desperate, like he was trying to erase something. Julian let himself get lost in it, ignoring the warning bells. He wanted to believe in the Theo who laughed too loud, who drew portraits of him in charcoal and called them proof of miracles. But the stranger's voice echoed in his head, and so did Theo's words from the bar, "I'm gonna ruin it." The days that followed were a tightrope walk. Julian felt Theo pulling away, his texts shorter, his smile strained. But then there were moments perfect. Fleeting moments where Theo would grab his hand in the middle of a crowded street, or kiss him under the glow of a street lamp, and Julian would forget the doubts creeping in. He told himself it was just love's growing pains, that every relationship had its shadows. But the shadows were growing longer. One evening, Julian found Theo at a gallery opening in Chelsea, surrounded by admirers of his latest paisea, haunting charcoal sketch of a boy with hollow eyes, breaking apart into fragments. The crowd loved it, but Julian saw something else, pain, raw and unfiltered, bleeding through every stroke. When he caught Theo's eye, there was a flicker of something like fear before he masked it with a grin. "What do you think? Broadway?" Theo asked, using the nickname he'd given Julian after their first date. "It's intense," Julian said, searching Theo's face. "Who's the boy?" Theo's smile faltered, just for a second. "Nobody real," he said, turning away to greet another guest. But Julian wasn't convinced. The boy in the sketch felt too alive, too personal. Later, at a diner over greasy fries and milkshakes, Julian pushed. "Theo, what's going on? You're here, but you're not here." Theo stared at his plate, his fingers tracing the rim of his glass. "You don't get it, Jules," he said finally, voice low. "Some things you can't outrun, no matter how much you want to." Julian reached for his hand, but Theo pulled back. "I'm not what you think I am." "Then tell me who you are," Julian pleaded. Theo's eyes softened, but he didn't answer. Instead, he paid the bill and left, leaving Julian with a sinking feeling that he was losing something he'd barely begun to hold. The truth came in pieces, like a puzzle Julian didn't want to solve. Theo started disappearing for hours, sometimes days, with vague excuses about family stuff or art projects. Julian tried to be patient, but the distance was suffocating. One night, desperate for answers, he followed Theo after he slipped out of a bar. It was reckless, stupid even, but Julian couldn't shake the need to know. He trailed Theo to a rundown apartment building in the Bronx, watching as he slipped inside. Minutes later, the same wiry man from before appeared at a window, his arm around Theo's shoulders. Julian's stomach twisted. He didn't know what he'd expected an affair, maybe, or a secret life, but the familiarity between them felt worse. It was intimate, possessive, and wrong. When Julian confronted Theo the next day, the fight was explosive. "Who is he?" "Theo," Julian demanded, his voice shaking. They were in Theo's studio, surrounded by half-finished canvases that suddenly felt like evidence of a life Julian didn't know. Theo's face was a storm of emotions: guilt, anger, fear. "His name's Marcus," he said finally. "He's my brother." Julian blinked, thrown. "Your brother?" Theo nodded, but his eyes were haunted. "Not by blood. Foster brother. We grew up together, and he's not someone you walk away from." The words came out haltingly, each one heavy with a story Theo wasn't ready to tell. Julian pressed, but Theo shut down, his voice sharp. "Leave it, Julian. You don't want this." But Julian did want it, all of it. The good and the ugly. He was in too deep, too in love to walk away. So he stayed, even as the cracks widened. Theo started canceling plans, his sketches growing darker, more violent. Julian found one tucked under a pile of buxom drawing of himself, but distorted, his face twisted in pain. It was beautiful and terrifying, and it made Julian's heart ache. One night, Theo showed up at Julian's apartment, eyes red and hands trembling. "I'm trying, Jules," he whispered, voice breaking. "I'm trying to be good for you. But Marcus, he knows how to get inside my head." Julian pulled him close, feeling Theo's heartbeat against his own, and made a silent vow, whatever Marcus was, whatever hold he had, Julian would fight it. For Theo. For them. But love, Julian was learning, wasn't always enough. Not when the past had claws. Winter came, and with it, a chill that settled into Julian's bones. He and Theo were still together, but it felt like they were holding onto a rope fraying at both ends. Theo's disappearances grew longer, his excuses thinner. Julian tried to fill the gaps with work, auditions, anything to keep his mind off the growing dread that Theo was slipping away. But every time Theo came back, with that crooked smile and a kiss that tasted like an apology, Julian let himself hope again. Then Marcus showed up at Julian's door. It was a freezing January night, and Julian was alone in his tiny Hell's Kitchen apartment when the knock came. Marcus stood there, lean and sharp-edged, his eyes glinting with something that made Julian's skin crawl. "You're the one Theo's obsessed with," Marcus said, not a question. His voice was smooth, almost charming, but there was a blade beneath it. "He talks about you like you're some kind of savior. Funny, considering he's the one who needs saving." Julian's heart pounded, but he held his ground. "What do you want?" Marcus stepped closer, too close, and Julian caught a whiff of cigarette smoke and something sour. "I want you to back off," Marcus said. "Theo's mine. Always has been. You're just a distraction." The words hit like a punch, but Julian didn't flinch. "He's not yours," he said, voice steady despite the fear clawing at him. "He's his own person." Marcus laughed, a cold, hollow sound. "You don't know him like I do. You don't know what he's capable of or what I'm capable of." After Marcus left, Julian called Theo, his hands shaking as he dialed. Theo didn't pick up. Hours later, he showed up at Julian's door, bruised and shaking, a cut above his eyebrow. "What happened?" Julian demanded, pulling him inside. Theo wouldn't look at him, his voice barely a whisper. "Marcus, he doesn't let go, Jules. He never has." The story spilled out in fragments. Theo and Marcus had grown up in a foster home in Georgia, a place where love was scarce and punishment was swift. Marcus, older and manipulative, had been Theo's protector and his tormentor. He'd taught Theo to survive, but at a cost, weaving a web of control that followed them even after they aged out. Theo had come to New York to escape, to rebuild, but Marcus had followed, sinking his claws back in. "He makes me feel like I'm nothing," Theo said, his voice breaking. "Like I'll never be anything without him." Julian held him, rage and heartbreak warring inside him. He wanted to fix this, to save Theo, but he was starting to see the truth. Theo had to save himself. They made a plan. Theo would cut contact with Marcus, block his number, move if he had to. Julian found a lawyer friend willing to help with a restraining order. For a few weeks, it worked. Theo seemed lighter, his sketches brighter, full of color again. They spent Valentine's Day in Central Park, stealing kisses under the snow, and Julian let himself believe they'd won. But Marcus wasn't done. One night, Julian came home to find his apartment trashed, photos torn, audition scripts shredded, and a single sketch left on his bed, Theo's face. Eyes hollow, just like the one from the gallery. A note was scrawled on the back, "He's mine." Julian's blood ran cold. This wasn't just about control anymore. It was a warning. He found Theo at his studio, packing a bag. "I have to leave," Theo said, his voice flat. "If I stay, he'll hurt you. I can't let that happen." Julian grabbed his shoulders, desperate. "You don't have to run. We can fight this together." But Theo's eyes were distant, like he was already gone. "You don't get it, Jules. He knows how to break me. Slowly. And if you're too close, he'll break you too." Julian refused to let go. He pulled Theo into his arms, kissing him fiercely, pouring every ounce of love and defiance into it. "I'm not losing you," he said. Not to him. Not to anyone. For the first time in weeks, Theo kissed him back with the same fire. And for a moment, they were unbreakable. But the storm was still coming. Spring arrived, but it brought no warmth. Julian and Theo were fighting a war on two fronts: Marcus's relentless pressure and their own fears. Theo moved in with Julian, a temporary fix to keep him safe, but the tension followed them. Every creak of the floorboards, every unanswered call, felt like Marcus lurking in the shadows. Julian started sleeping with a baseball bat by the bed, while Theo's nightmares grew worse, his cries waking them both in the dead of night. They tried to hold on to the good moments. They'd cook together, laughing over burnt pancakes, or spend evenings watching old musicals, Theo teasing Julian about his Broadway dreams. But the weight of Marcus's presence was always there, a poison seeping into their love. Julian saw it in Theo's eyes, the fear that he'd never truly escape, that he'd drag Julian down with him. The breaking point came in April. Julian got a call from an unknown number while at work. It was Marcus, his voice calm but venomous. "You think you can keep him? I made him who he is. You're nothing." Julian hung up, heart racing, but the words burrowed deep. That night, he came home to find Theo gone, his sketchbook left open on the table. The page showed two figures, one reaching for the other, but their hands didn't touch. A note was tucked inside. "I'm sorry, Jules. I have to end this." Julian tore through the city, checking every place they'd ever been. He found Theo at the Brooklyn cafe where they'd met, sitting alone, staring at his untouched coffee. "You can't do this," Julian said, sliding into the seat across from him. "You can't let him win." Theo's eyes were red, his voice hollow. "I'm not worth this, Julian. You deserve someone who's not broken." The words shattered something in Julian. He grabbed Theo's hand, refusing to let go. "You're not broken," he said fiercely. "You're the strongest person I know. And I love you, not some idea of you, but you, with all your scars." Theo broke then, tears streaming down his face, and Julian pulled him close, whispering promises into his hair. They went to the police the next day. With Julian's lawyer friend, they built a case: harassment, stalking, threats. It wasn't easy. Marcus was slippery, always one step ahead, but they got the restraining order. Theo started therapy, slowly untangling the years of control Marcus had woven into Hi's mind. It wasn't a clean victory. Marcus vanished, but the fear lingered, a ghost they both carried. Months later, they stood together in that same Brooklyn cafe, a year after they'd met. Theo's hand was steady in Julian's, his smile real again. He'd started painting vibrant murals that filled gallery walls, each one a step toward healing. Julian had landed a small role in an off-Broadway show. A start. They weren't reborn in some perfect storybook way. Their love was still messy, still scarred, but it was theirs. As they walked out into the spring evening, Theo stopped, pulling Julian close. "I thought I'd ruin you," he said softly. "But you saved me." Julian kissed him, right there on the sidewalk, not caring who saw. "We saved each other," he said. And in that moment, under the city's endless lights, they were enough.